Hello, so this is the Linguistics 301 History of English, our lecture on language change. So, in this lecture, we're going to cover what language change involves at a very broad and sort of basic understanding. The entire course is about how language changes, but we're going to talk about just some of the broad understandings of language change, as well as a little bit about where we get the kinds of sources for data and information that we'll be using throughout the course for the history of English, how this relates to language change, and some of the aspects that are involved in that. So, if we start with language change can occur in any part of a language system. So, if we're thinking about what sort of structural aspects of language exist, it can be in phonology, the sound system. So, thinking about some examples as we're going through each of these, phonology and the sound system that English would have. V, the sound that we have now as a V sound, was once only an allophone of F. We didn't actually have that as an individual sound in English, and now over time it has become a separate phoneme, mostly because of the influence of French over time. We have things like morphology or pieces of meaning, the different sorts of affixes and words and roots that we have, where a lot of change has happened in that system in English over the course of the last several hundred years. And one big change example would be the idea of case, which we'll talk about in upcoming lectures as well, which was once a very common feature in English, but we don't really use anymore. Many other languages do still use case markings, which are different morphemes that attach to a word to give a relationship between different words in a sentence. We used to have a lot of them in English, and now we pretty much have gotten rid of all of them. And so that shows one example of a different kind of change. With syntax, or our sentence structure, how we put words together into bigger units, we used to have a much more flexible word order in English. We'll see lots of examples of that. Now we have a very strict word order. There's not a lot of flexibility that we have in most of our sentences to still get the same kind of meaning, because we've lost a lot of that morphology. So syntax has sort of picked it up and put the ordering of that as more rigid as a result of that. And then also things like semantics and meaning, where the different kinds of meaning that we can have for words can change over time. And we see lots of examples of this. So words do frequently change meanings over periods of times. We'll see many examples throughout the semester. One example is the word hound versus the word dog. So hound, or hund in Old English, used to mean just dog, and dog was a very specific type of hunting dog. And over time, they've sort of switched meaning, where now dog is the generic term that we use, and hound is a specific kind of dog, and those are often the ones we think of as sort of hunting kind of dogs. And then also just the words that we have in a language will change over time. We'll bring in words, we'll get rid of words. Words will sort of come and go from a language very frequently. So things like thou and thy are no longer part of our everyday language. We see them as very archaic, whereas you is something that we use very frequently now that we didn't used to always have. And so we can see lots of examples. Things like slang can come and go much quicker. But there are a lot of times that the words in a language will change over time as well. So as we're thinking about all of these different aspects of language change, when we're referring to language change in the class and in the kinds of things that we're looking at, we're referring mostly to permanent changes to the language. And so things like just a slip of a tongue, or an attempt to change something that isn't actually adopted by all of the speakers, wouldn't be the kind of true language change examples that we're looking for in this class. So if you think about trying to make fetch happen in Mean Girls, this was something that didn't really get taken up by people, so this wouldn't really be seen as an example of language change, at least in the film, right? So now we see people sort of using it ironically, and then maybe less ironically over time. So it could become part of our language change over time, but in the example, it wouldn't have been, because it wasn't really taken up by the speakers and used regularly. And when we think about language change, there's a couple different kinds of determinations for language change. So the first one we'll talk about is whether or not something is systematic or something is sporadic. So if we think about what a sporadic change is, just like the word sort of implies, this is something that doesn't apply to the entire system. So this would be something that's only here or there, maybe adopted by a group of speakers, but not all of the speakers. A common way that this happens is an occasional addition of a vocabulary item, and especially with things like slang. So slang is something that might apply to some people, but not others. So we can have generational slang. We can have slang that kind of comes in for a little bit and then goes away for a little bit, and isn't something that's systematic and changes throughout the entire language. Sound changes can sometimes do this as well, where there's a particular word that changes, but we don't see this as a pattern across other words that have the same kind of sounds. So pronouncing yuck as yuck using that х sound, isn't something we really see in other English words, but you do sometimes hear people say it with the х sound, usually for emphasis. And this would be sporadic because we don't find this in other words that have the same environment. So you wouldn't find this in something like tuck. You wouldn't have tach, and that wouldn't really make sense. So we don't see this as happening systematically across the language. Or pronouncing catch to rhyme with wretch instead of saying catch or hatch. And this would also be sporadic because we don't see other words that have that ATCH also being pronounced with a more kind of sound. So patch isn't pronounced like petch for most people. So we don't see that happening systematically across all of the speakers. We just see it in specific little environments. But importantly, these kinds of sporadic changes can eventually lead to a systematic change if enough speakers start taking it up and if it starts being used by everyone. The systematic changes are the things that we're going to primarily be focusing on, primarily be interested in. We will see some sporadic change here and there. We'll see a lot of dialect differences, times where that kind of thing happens, but we're going to be looking for these systematic changes mostly. And they can be either conditioned or unconditioned, where there's some sort of context that it happens, or maybe we can't really pinpoint a specific context. So something that's conditioned is brought about by a context. And this could be a linguistic environment, or this could be something more social that's not as linguistic. So a conditioned systematic change would be a sound merger like pin and pen. So in many dialects, those are both pronounced the same way. So you can say, hand me that pin over there, I need to write something down. But this is conditioned by a specific environment. So this merger happens in front of preceding nasal sounds, an M or an N sound. So you don't find it in a distinction of hill or hell or middle or metal, which do still retain their different vowels. This is something that's only conditioned by that nasal sound that's coming after it. And then if we have an unconditioned one, this would be something where we can't figure out or can't find a specific condition, or it could just be happening under all conditions. So there's times where you don't necessarily know exactly what's conditioning this change to happen, or times where everyone has just already done it. So something like an unconditioned one where we don't really see a specific condition would be a stress change in disyllabic words in some areas. So sometimes you might hear certain people say police instead of police, or defense instead of defense, or Detroit instead of Detroit, where there doesn't seem to be a specific reason why this is happening. We don't see it across words that have a sort of systematic explanation for it, but we do see this in disyllabic words in some dialects and not in others. The other major distinction that we'll have for language change is whether something is synchronic or diachronic. And so with synchronic changes, these are changes that are happening at a particular moment in time in a language system. So these are things that happen usually with the sound system, things like phonemes versus allophones. So we pronounce some sounds a little bit differently depending on the sounds they're next to. And that just happens because of how we're moving our mouths, how we're making sounds. And so this can also happen with certain syntactic structures, things that are changing in a specific moment based on how we're pronouncing something or what's coming next to it in a word. And this is often the focus of a lot of modern documentation, a lot of variation studies and sociolinguistics, whereas the other option would be diachronic changes, or things that are happening within a language system over a long period of time. So things like historical constructions or protoforms, trying to figure out what a form looked like before versus what it looks like today. And so this is the focus of historical linguistics, and this will also be the focus that we'll predominantly see throughout our class as well. So if we look at some examples of different kinds of language change that we might see in this class, these changes can lead to things like loss of something, but it can also lead to the gain of something as well. So typically if a system loses something, they're inevitably going to gain something else in its place. So if we're looking at an example in English that we just mentioned, if we lose case morphology in English, we end up gaining a rigid syntax order instead. And so we still have to cover all of our bases. We still have to have some way to convey all of the information that needs to be conveyed. So we tend to replace something if something's lost more often than just letting something leave, or more often than just letting something show up unexpectedly. So if we look at the different kinds of structures, if we're looking at sounds, we lost over time a distinction between long vowels and short vowels. We used to have longer vowels and shorter vowels that sounded different in length and made a different meaning. We've sort of lost those over time, but we've gained some diphthongs. So our oi sound in a word like Boise, for instance, is something we didn't have in Old English and Middle English, and something that we've eventually gained over time as these other sounds have gone away. For morphology, as we mentioned, we lost a lot of distinctions in case, but we've gained other sort of constructions that we've been able to put together with word formation, so we can combine things like verbs and adverbs to create nouns. So drop out as an example of that, where you're taking a verb and a particle, you're putting it together, and that can be now used as a noun. So we have new ways of forming words, new ways of putting things together that we didn't used to have. With syntax, we used to have a freedom of word order. We could move things around more, and we don't really have that any longer. But we've gained a lot of tense and aspect distinctions that we didn't used to have in English. So we can make a distinction between the past perfect, I had painted my room, and a past causative, I had my room painted, where the words are the same, but the meaning and the interpretation would be different. And that's not something that we used to have in older forms of English. We've lost a lot of words in English over time as they've fallen out of use, but we've also gained a lot of words in English over time as we've borrowed them, as new technology comes around, as new experiences come around. Things like meaning can change as well, so we don't keep all of the same meanings of things. So do no longer can mean to put into, but we use do for other things. And then we used to refer to hand as just the actual hand itself, but now we can use that as sort of a helping kind of thing, like give me a hand, adding a metaphorical example, a metaphorical meaning to that. We've also changed the way that we spell things. So we used to have some letters and graphemes in English that we no longer have. So the letter eth or thorn, which we'll see a lot in Old English, no longer are part of our spelling system, but we've made a distinction now between a V and a U in our spelling system instead of them being used interchangeably, which you can see in some older writings and things that are sort of Roman inspired. And so when we're looking at how these things take place over time, some of these changes can occur at different times and at different rates of speed as well. So sometimes we can get a loan word, something like Sputnik from the 50s when we started getting into space travel. It was created, it was introduced, and it became widespread within days because it was something that was important to the news, important to our everyday lives at the time. But a lot of times these changes can happen much more slowly, especially things like sound changes. So it might seem quick for an individual speaker, but it can take generations for a community or an entire language of speakers to change something over time. So some examples that we'll see in this class are things like the Great Vowel Shift, which happened over a couple of 100 years. And so while individuals would probably have started shifting them much quicker within their own speech, over time this happened over a couple of 100 years and took a very long time to actually complete the process thoroughly. And then others are things that have been going on for almost 1,000 years and are still sort of going on in some cases as well. So we used to have some aspiration with W, so the H instead of W. So in a word like which, it could be pronounced which. And this is something that was much more common in Middle English and doesn't really get found frequently any longer, but there are still some speakers that will use this. We find this more often in some upper class dialects and not so often in more working class dialects, but it is still something that, depending on the speaker, we might still find occasionally. So there's always going to be that variability in language because change is constant. And what this is going to sort of challenge us to understand is that we're going to have to recognize that there's not always going to be as much consistency as we might like in the kinds of data we're looking at, in the kinds of sources we're looking at. And there's some reasons for that. The kinds of information that we have, the sources we have, are mostly just texts. We don't have recordings of things that go back hundreds of years. We don't have the exact way that things were spoken, but we can approximate things pretty closely with how many texts we have. And we have some texts in English that date back at least to the 7th century. And there's not a lot of them that are that old, but we do have some. And as time goes on, we have many, many more texts that we can find in English. But there are some problems with relying solely on texts when we're trying to do an analysis linguistically to understand how sounds have changed and how different structures have changed. Some of the problems that we might encounter throughout the semester as we're looking through this are that a lot of our oldest texts are actually just translations from French or Latin. So not all of the texts that we have in English were originally written in English, especially earlier on when English wasn't as powerful of a language. So this might not give us as much information about the true syntax of the language because it's being translated from languages that have different syntactic structures. Often texts might be missing information, so we can't necessarily answer specific questions on how a particular construction existed if we don't have examples of it. So there could be times that we just don't have examples of certain kinds of tense structures or certain kinds of words forming in certain ways. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it couldn't have been there. We just don't have any evidence of it. So we have to take it at face value based on the evidence we have. We can't question texts in the same way, so we have to interpret them just based on what we see, and we have to recognize that there could be multiple reasons why we have different forms showing up in texts. So sometimes this could be dialect differences. We see this a lot, especially in Middle English, but it could just be that someone wrote it down wrong because everything was written by hand in the older forms. So we have to be able to distinguish what these kinds of conventions are, and we have to be able to distinguish what is actually happening based on how things were written. And so things were written more based on how people heard them because it wasn't standardized, which does help us, but it may not reflect all of the differences in language usage that we might be looking for. So if we're looking for some useful sources that we'll be able to find, some of the best sources are actually from semi-educated writers that have learned how to write but haven't learned any sort of standardization. And so this can give us a lot of information better than some of the things like scribes or highly educated writers. So some of the examples that we have for pronunciation in early America are the droppings of R from American colonists because they're written still in the writings of educated people, but in legal records of less educated townspeople that learned how to write but didn't learn standardized forms. You see a lot of times where they just don't put the R in because they're not writing or they're not pronouncing it. So you get something like Edward without an R because they're not actually pronouncing that R, so they're not including it in their writing. So we can look at how things are written and get a lot of information there. And sometimes some of the more recent ones, we get some more descriptions about English, but we didn't really have recordings of spoken English until the early 20th century. So it's really only been a little over 100 years that we've had recordings of spoken English. And so we can use some of that to also extrapolate what things would have been like before. So the way that we pronounce things today, especially with things like loan words from other language, can also help us date when certain sound changes happened. So the word dish and the word discus are both coming from Latin, but the dish word would have been borrowed much later after we had already changed our word final sk sound to a sh sound, whereas discus still has that sk sound, and it's not word final, but it's retaining some of the other information that was on there. So we can sort of say, well, we must have borrowed discus much earlier from Latin because it features what the original sound was, whereas dish would have been in an environment for a sound change, and we borrowed it after that change had already happened. We can also get a lot of information about dialect differences based on where someone is from. So more rural dialects tend to have older forms of words or older forms of morphology that take longer to provide change than urban areas. So if we compare English sources from rural areas in the northern part of England versus areas around London, which led a lot of the sound changes we see, we can expect London's changes to happen fast and first, and then over time they would spread out and reach those other areas that are further away. We also have a lot of really helpful information for the history of English just through our spelling. We haven't really changed our spelling since we first created our spelling system about 500 years ago. So this sort of gives us a museum of some of our pronunciation history. So words like sword and knee and though and dumb used to pronounce all of those additional consonants that we don't see pronounced anymore. So sword, knie, though, dumb, where we actually did pronounce all of those different sounds that aren't pronounced anymore. But this isn't always exactly useful because things like island or ghost or hole never pronounced those additional letters in there, and it's more a result of other aspects like borrowing the word from other languages or just the way that it became written for other conventions that just sort of held on. And so when we're thinking about looking at these, some of the other problems that arise are things about looking at standard versus non-standard varieties. So most times when we're thinking about language, we're usually looking at writings and we're usually looking at translations that are put into standardized forms of English. So even when you read things like Beowulf and the Canterbury Tales in English classes, they're usually redone into more modernized spelling and into more standardized English. And the history of the language ends up not really being as easily seen because it's presented as this sort of clean and well-defined aspect. It tends to focus on whatever the dominant dialect would be, so standard English in America today, London's dialect in England earlier, whereas other dialects that are chosen don't necessarily have the same kind of power, but are still represented in a lot of writings. So even though we tend to focus on standard English, most people don't usually speak standard English in their everyday lives. We tend to not use standard varieties in our everyday settings. We prefer things that reveal aspects of some of our identity, some of our origins. And so non-standard dialects are more common in how we speak every day, even if speakers are proficient in standard forms. So even though these non-standard forms are equally structured and systematic, we tend not to see them in writing as much as we see them in speech. Although, as I mentioned, some of those semi-literate writers and some of the earlier writings that we'll see, especially in Middle English, will reveal a lot about someone's dialect because they tend to write how they spoke. So informal language is going to be really important and really, really helpful to us, even though there are going to be various levels of formality in language usage in anyone's everyday life. So even when you're speaking standard English, you're going to have different ways of saying the same thing. So nice to meet you, or it's been a pleasure to make your acquaintance, mean about the same thing, but you would use one in certain settings and another in different settings. So these different kinds of distinctions will often be missing from how we can see some of the examples in English history, especially if we don't know the context of where things are coming from, or if all we have are writings. But it's really important to remember that variation is going to be natural. It's predictable at any stage of a language's history. And so we can see all of the non-standard forms common in present-day English, even alongside standardized forms. So it would make sense that we would also expect that kind of variation in previous time periods prior to when we standardized English, so Old and Middle English periods, and also when standardization began. So overall, the takeaway of our data, the takeaway of thinking about how language changes and how we can document this, is that you should expect some inconsistencies in our data, in our materials throughout the semester. The things that we use today, even like spell check editors, are still useful. We still use those even though we have standardized forms and have had standardized forms for a long time. And these help us ensure that we're representing standard English properly. So we can expect that before these developments, there's probably even less consistency to be seen. So we'll see a lot of variation, things that might not seem as systematic as we would like, things that sort of buck the trend where we're looking at a pattern, we're finding a pattern, but maybe this one text doesn't seem to fit it very well and we can't really explain it. We will have cases like that. So being patient about that will be really helpful. So that is this lecture. If you do have questions, as always, you can email me. You can schedule office hours with the website that's also in my email signature. It's on the syllabus. And you can also, I encourage you to bring questions to our synchronous class. We'll try to start off class every day with questions about the lecture that you might have. So bring those questions to class if anything is unclear or you want some additional examples, anything like that. And I encourage us to start class each day with those.